Dave is professor and head of the physiotherapy department at Terana Physiotherapy College, Mumbai. She has completed her master's and bachelor's from Mumbai. She has more than 20 years of experience. She has served in academics in various roles and capacities at Rajiv Gandhi University of Health Sciences and Maharashtra University of Health Sciences. Her major interest is in adult neurophysiotherapy, especially this stroke rehabilitation. We welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you, Kshitija.
How are you, ma'am?
Absolutely fine. Thank
I
you so
hope
much.
you're doing good in this pandemic
Very
situation.
well. I'm doing very well. Thank you very much.
Without wasting much time, I don't want to stand between you and the audience. So, over to you, ma'am.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I'm going to start now.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's talk on the range of motion and manual muscle testing, which are the critical indicators of physiotherapy practice. Now, the topic, as the title suggests, is an extremely simple one, a humble one, which I may add is deceptively simple. Now, let's go through the entire session and discuss further as to what we hope to achieve or obtain through this discussion. Now, I don't need to tell everyone who is listening, who are physiotherapy professionals, that range of motion and manual muscle testing are proverbial sword and shield of a physical therapist. These are two tools that are taught to every therapist in their infancy as a basic screening and assessment methods. We've all spent hours and hours on learning the techniques of documenting the range of motion and the manual muscle testing. Now, there are absolutely no arguments about the importance of these two time tested parameters to the practice of physiotherapy. We, as movement specialists, movement being our core domain, are very well aware that functional independence is the prime goal that we hope to achieve for all our clients. Our reliance on functional independence makes the range of motion and strength two very important and interlinked parameters which are going to influence our rehabilitation strategies and the techniques of rehabilitation that we choose to perform on our patients. So the question then arises is, if the techniques are very good, time tested and relevant, then why are we discussing it? What are we hoping to achieve? So we are hoping to address certain questions and gray areas through today's talk to gain further understanding. We need to start making efforts towards standardizing the clinical tools, ironing out the differences so that we make them better and more relevant for all of us. So let's begin by talking about the range of motion. Now, range of motion, as we all know, is assessment and documentation of the active and passive mobility of joints, which are assessed using universal goniometer. It can be used to track the change in the patient's status. It gives you an objective, it gives you a numerical value, which is very easy to keep a track of. It also describes the end fields, which are further used for differentiating the structural involvement, which may help you in deciding the rehab strategy or in differential diagnosis. So the pros are, it's a simple clinical tool, it's objective, and it gives you an overview of the structural impairments which are going to hinder your free mobility. Let's go through the negative points or the cons. Now, sometimes it is difficult for a therapist to handle goniometer or execute goniometry with obese patients. For patients with a particular age group, in case of pediatrics, handling goniometers does require practice. We all know that through our experience, and the documentation and the entire effort of taking the range can be time consuming. So people who are having busy OPDs, people who are working in government hospitals may not necessarily invest that much of time or may not have that much of time to spend for documenting the range of motion. Let's go through the manual muscle testing briefly. We all know it's a procedure for evaluation of strength of a muscle or a group of muscles based upon the effective performance of the movement in relation to other forces, particularly gravity, through the available range of motion. We have three systems for grading them. We have the Kendall, Oxford, and the MRC, the Medical Research Council ones, which are very commonly used by therapists for testing. Again, the pros of manual muscle testing. These are simple bedside clinical test positions which can be taught and executed easily. It evaluates the force producing capacity of skeletal muscles, which is supposed to be the primary function of skeletal muscles. The test positions are thoughtfully designed to accommodate different alignment of muscle fibers and to put those muscles at an advantage while you are testing them. Now let's go through the cons or the questions on the manual muscle testing as well. The biggest question that almost all of us at some point in our career have faced is the reliability or the inconsistency between two therapists about the grading. So in other words, it's a subjective grading system. It is not functional oriented. It doesn't talk about the activities of daily living. It may not be relevant in all the clinical scenarios, particularly if the patient is in the ICU or certain in-ward situations where you may not be able to achieve the test positions that you hope to achieve. It evaluates just one component of skeletal muscle performance, which is strength. Now, if you have a CNS damage or a PNS damage, the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system damage, and if you have tonal changes, which can range from flaccidity, hypotonia to hypertonia, rigidity, and spasticity, MMT may not be a relevant tool or a tool enough to give you an insight into the movement problems of those patients. So you always need to have further evaluation of those muscles. Now, many of us have heard the term of functional strength testing, okay? Especially when you are unable to put the patient in a particular test position, you would rather check whatever is the available position and whatever is the available range, not considering the changes in the outer, middle, and inner range of a particular muscle. Now, there is always a question of variability of the term maximal resistance. Now, maximal resistance is the resistance that the patient can take or the maximal effort that the patient can put in. Now, it describes the patient's best effort, but there may be differences between the patients and the therapist structure, and thereby the discord between the ability of therapists to give that much of maximal resistance is always there. So that is one area of maximal resistance and correspondingly submaximal resistance that we need to ask ourselves about what we need to do to clarify that. Now, evaluation and grading of painful muscles and movements always remains a query. Okay, if the pain is present in the muscles or in the joints, the performance is definitely going to get affected. The next question we need to ask ourselves is the manual muscle testing of small muscles, especially of hand and feet. Now, if we talk about gravity and the test positions and the grades in reference to gravity, does the gravity act on small joints? Does it make sense to have anti-gravity positions for those small muscles, or do we rather evaluate the hand function, which may be a more functional outcome measure to give you an overall idea about the group of muscles and their functioning? Application of MMT to different age groups is also always a question. Now, many of us or many of our students have issues with subcategorization of grades in terms of plus or minus. So you have a 3 plus, you have a 3 minus, and it is always a source of confusion for the students and the therapists alike as to who means what and who decides plus or minus on what basis. And that is always a question. The concept of gravity as a force and the debate on the anti-gravity position. Should you be testing the muscles in an anti-gravity position rather sitting or standing, or do you always prefer supine and prone positions? We need to acknowledge other forces, especially external forces, which are acting on the skeletal muscles and not just gravity. So if you could think a bit about the other forces that are being placed on the human body, maybe we could make it into a better tool. The traditional MMT positions, the testing is preferred with concentric isotonic movements. Eccentric and isometric contractions are usually not preferred while you are doing MMT. Now, All of us know that eccentric and isometric contraction versus isotonic contractions are always going to have different energy requirements, and muscles may behave differently with different contractions that have different energy consumptions. So can we take that into consideration? So again, I go back to the question as to why are we discussing this? We are discussing this because we need to highlight the gray areas, we need to start a debate amongst ourselves and reach a conclusion. So let's go through the gray areas one by one. The first question that we need to ask ourselves is the relevance. Do we need to use the range of motion and manual muscle testing as assessment tools with the technological advances that have happened in the area of motion analysis? You have smartphone applications which can replace the traditional goniometers. They are based on Android phones, they are based on iPhones. You have the speed of motion that can be calculated by those apps. You have the wireless inertial measuring units. You have machine learning using inertial sensors. You have 3D analysis of motions. In all of these, where do the range of motion and MMT sustain their relevance? The other question that we need to ask ourselves is the importance of functional improvement. Rehabilitation is always performance based. So, with newer and more functional outcome measures available, do we still need to document the range of motion and MMT? Has our reliance on functionality and functional improvement made these assessment methods redundant? Is it better to use functional outcome measures that reflect a change in performance? Uh, that is an area for discussion. The next question we need to ask ourselves is the differential diagnosis. How much do these two contribute to the differential diagnosis? All of us, through our experience, would say a eminent yes, emphatic yes, saying that yes, we can differentially diagnose using the range of motion, especially the end fields, which is an experiential evidence. But is there any empirical evidence for the same? Do we place enough emphasis on these discerning abilities of these tools? Do we teach them to our undergraduate students? And do we back up our end field analysis by research? The next question that we need to address is mobility assessment versus performance assessment. What is better? Now, performance-based testing is patient's own performance versus the clinician's testing, where the clinician does a particular test on that person and decides upon the goals of management, versus performance-based testing, which gives you a more overall functional view of that person's problems. So should we have either or should we have a combination of these two? The next question is the important question of clinical usage. A lot of professionals which are starting their clinical journey shy away from using these tools, that is the range of motion and manual muscle testing, as a part of their assessment protocol. Now, I have come to this conclusion after doing an informal survey for about 60 of young professionals who have started their career in the last 5 years. Now, after talking to them and interviewing them, they described these tools as being too academic. They rely more on visual confirmation of the range and functional outcome measures that reflect the change in the patient's functional status. According to them, there is a lot of subjectivity, difficulty in handling goniometers, time and patience that is required for measuring range of motion and MMT, and they would rather take functional outcome measures or videos of patients demonstrating their abilities to compare the before and after scenarios. So the question now is, where do we go from here? Do we stay invested in the assessment and recording of the traditional range of motion and MMT, or do we adopt newer versions of mobility assessment? If yes, then how do we convince fellow professionals on the usefulness of these parameters? Is it possible for us to describe some assessment protocols which are then endorsed by council, or can we make it mandatory for professionals to use a standardized assessment format so that it benefits all of us? So stay with me while we are going to be debating this deceptively simple topic of range of motion and MMT as the critical parameters of practice. I would now request Dr. Anil Bhave to take over from here, and I'll join you back for the question and answer sessions. Thank you.
Sure, ma'am. Thank you so much for perfectly bringing out your gray areas and the problems and challenges which are faced by our professionals. One question I have for you, ma'am. As you have already mentioned that the movement has a lot of forces acting on it. So do you think that MMT justify for focusing on gravity and not on other forces while doing a movement?
Yes, exactly. So that is one of the questions that was brought about in a conference at neurological rehabilitation, where people said that if you consider the movement, the human body has internal forces, external forces. Okay, and if you consider the movement, it is a resultant combination of all those forces. So while you are testing muscles, why just acknowledge gravity? Okay, you have friction, you have ground reaction forces. Okay, so if you are going to ignore the other forces, then are we measuring the true potential of that particular muscle? So we need to actually start a debate, uh, acknowledging the fact that there are other forces which are acting on the human body, and that can also affect the movement performance. So having said that, we need to work towards it. We need to start working towards projects that define these forces.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. And I will again ask you to join us back again.
Sure.
Now it's time to call upon our next speaker, Dr. Anil Bhave. He is a clinical director at Orthopedic Rehabilitation and Wasserman Gate Laboratory, and he is a chief of strategy for rehab engineering and virtual rehab at Sinai Rehabilitation. He has developed and patented dynamic casting and bracing technique for treatment of stiffness and contractures. He has been certified in various techniques such as dry needling, kinesiological EMG, and blood flow restriction therapy. He is an accomplished researcher and lecturer, as he has published more than 100 papers in peer-reviewed journals and taken more than 300 lectures nationally and internationally. He has been recipient of various awards. Thank you, sir, for joining us today. It is, I think, early in the morning, Sunday morning.
Correct. It is about 7 o'clock in the morning.
Okay, sir. Thank you for
Yes.
joining so early to us. So over to you, sir, now.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
So, good morning to my friends, if there are any awake in the morning in the United States, and good evening to all my friends in India and Southeast Asia. This is a topic that is controversial to young versus old. I'm a physical therapist with approximately 40 years of clinical practice experience. I learned it differently. I do practice it differently than I learned it. You know, when we were students at KEM or at Haji Ali, we still saw a significant number of polio patients. And when we saw those patients, the muscle testing, by the way, it was developed by Florence Kendall, the Kendall method. I actually had pleasure to work with her in 1989 and 90 as her teaching assistant for a class that she used to teach. And she would always tell me that, polio taught her one thing about grade 0 through grade 3 very well, because it gave you those type of weaknesses all the time. But she admitted much to myself that grade 4 or 5 or the strengths were not as good defined. And today's, especially orthopedic practice, determines that grade 4 and 5 for functional use as the patients advance to more advanced strategies. So what is the right mix? Where do we use it correctly? And what I'm going to share with you is probably a bias towards orthopedics and a bias towards lower limb because lower limb is so much interconnected due to close kinetic chain. If you can solve the problem in lower limb that has weight bearing, that has interconnectivity between hip, knee, and ankle, then other joints which are not so much weight bearing, especially upper extremity, become much easier. So what I want to share with you is how I have practiced, what I believe in. I have done it this way. Now, my way is not always the expressway or the highway, but it is the way that I want to define and show you what works for me. So this lecture is evidence-based as well as based on 40 years of experience as a practicing therapist, and no financial benefits are directly or indirectly linked to this lecture are given to me or my family. So this is a very simplistic thing. One of my friends who is a therapist, he always says this: what do therapists do? We stretch, we strengthen, and we functionally retrain. So, don't make it too complicated. Everything we do for improving range of motion is stretch. It's a mobilization. He just puts it simply as stretch, but it's a mobilization, it's soft tissue mobilization. It's a stretch. We apply splints, it's a stretch. We strengthen, so we use modalities to strengthen our patient's legs so they can function better. But we first do stretch, strengthen to get function better. So that's what we do. So what should we test is a question. So if you do not measure, how do you know your treatment is effective? Is my question to everybody that is against just measuring functional testing, because there are many scenarios in patients' journey or continuum of care where they're not ready for functional testing. So it may be applied to a very small group of patients where functional testing is a very effective tool, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's an effective tool for all and all of the patients that are going through the journey of recovery. So that would be the question that I would ask, is that we probably have to create a hybrid model of physical examination and functional testing to really get to the bottom of our evaluations. So the question is, are range of motion and muscle testing critical indicators of practice, or is functional testing and PROMs enough for practice? When I say PROM, I mean patient-reported outcomes, and functional testing is either supervised or unsupervised or using apps, things like that. So we have gone through this journey, so I'll share some of the evidence there. So can you perform functional tests in acute, subacute, non-ambulatory, unstable, weak, multi-joint environment? Probably not in all the cases. So you still need to go back to your hands-on evaluatory techniques to assess patients' strength, mobility, flexibility, as well as if you have multi-joint involvement, then you need to test them all. So let us discuss. What does stretch do? Improve flexibility, improve range of motion. Strengthen, improve strength, endurance, stamina, explosive power, and hypertrophy. Functionally retrain, improve coordination, agility, and speed. So we have to test all of this. You can't just do one thing at a time. And if you look at the literature, we have gone in 1990s, I give you an orthopedic experience. In 1980s and 90s, when we first started doing ACL reconstruction, which is probably one of the highest number of surgeries that are being done in the world today for reconstructive orthopedics, everybody was doing focused strength training and no functional testing or functional training. Then came the era of 1990s, late 90s, early 2000, where people were going towards more functional testing, functional training. And then came the papers in the last 5 years that said that if you don't do isolated quadriceps strengthening, then you are likely to get re-injured in your ACL faster and also have re-tears of your ACL. So we are going back again to isokinetic testing and strengthening. So we don't need to always figure out what's new is always better. We need to also remember old is gold, and many times the things that worked before should be adopted in our practice. So that's the message I want to give you here in my lecture. How to get best range of motion, focus, customize, and hands-on therapy. What is hands-on therapy? Well, hands-on therapy is not just about stabilizing, it's about guiding, it's about resisting, it's about applying forces in the correct direction. And the same thing applies to functional testing. So this is my favorite slide. Avoid circuit training therapy. You have to avoid this. You have to have some personalized. I am not saying that you need to spend the entire time you are with patient doing this, but you have to spend some time with the patient. And unsupervised functional testing is useless. That's been shown. What I mean by unsupervised testing is if patients are let to do what they want, they will always cheat. Patients will always follow the path of least resistance, just like water does. Water flows down the path. So if you are going to just depend on doing functional testing, but it's not supervised, then it's very difficult to obtain reliable results. So remember that there is a problem on the other side too of functional testing, is that you need to be carefully supervising what the patients are doing and sometimes even stabilizing correctly. You can't be standing here in the back of the room like this and achieve good results. This is not functional testing, this is more functional training type of workout or circuit training workout. And that may work for normal people that are motivated. It doesn't even work for people who are not motivated but are normal, and definitely does not work for patients who are not normal. So we have to remember that. And then what is the evidence today? This is about total hip and total knee. Despite improvement in self-reported outcomes, meaning the PROMs, the patient-reported outcomes, relating to physical function, evidence shows that physical activity does not increase after total hip or total knee arthroplasty. So we can't always hide behind what patients report because it's not always reliable. They are invested in what they have done, and because they are invested in what they have done, sometimes they tend to simplify and over-report on the patient-reported outcomes, and the physical function does not change. So we need to be careful with that, and we have to be able to marry both of them together to get the best outcome of the patients. This is about functional rehab is not always good. Isolated isokinetic testing and training needed to return to sports and reduce risk of injury. This is in ACL patients. Only 1 out of 5 achieve symmetrical knee function at 6 months. Now, it is early on, but the point is, if you don't do focused testing and focused strengthening, how do you get better? And the hallmark of strengthening an orthopedic patient is what we call 1RM. We have to know what is 1RM. That means we have to measure 1RM. So let's say a patient does a lift, a knee extension, and can move the leg in extension, full range of motion at 20 pounds of weight times 5. Then you need to calculate what the 1RM is. Well, what's the 1RM of that? Is usually 27 kilos or 28 kilos. So there are methods of calculating what 1RM is. Why is it 1RM so important? When you know 1RM, then only you can exercise a muscle at 70% of 1RM for multiple reps to get strengthening effect. And then only when you can apply a force of 85 or 80 or 85% of 1RM, you actually get hypertrophy. So if you don't assess what patient is doing, which is, I call it muscle testing. Everything we do is not just 1/5 is muscle testing. Everything we do around the patient is a muscle testing. So let me repeat that concept again. If you can move your knee extension and produce and move at 20 kilograms of weight 6 or 7 times, your actual 1RM is 27 kilos. But in order to achieve strengthening, you need to apply 65 to 70% of 1RM with multiple reps. If you want to cause hypertrophy, you want to use 80% of 1RM. These are measurements. They have to be measured so that you can actually strengthen that muscle and cause hypertrophy. You can do this in a leg press, you can do it in a knee extension, you can do it with hip abductors, you can do it with any muscle. So the point of this is, in patients, how could you achieve that without actually measuring it? That's the point I would like to make here as a support of measuring muscle strength. Range of motion, how do we measure it? And I'm going to focus on lower extremity because lower extremity is a little bit more complex. It is it's a closed kinetic chain for most function, because most of our function is upright position and not in sitting or lying down for lower extremity. And if you see, there is such varied degrees of angle, and this is your hip joint angle. This is just walking. It's not even other activities, walking. It's 40 degrees to 0 or minus 10 degrees of extension, or 10 degrees of extension to 40 again. Here is your knee going from 0 to 20, back to 10, back to 5, back to 65 degrees of flexion. Here is your ankle, first plantar flexing, then dorsiflexing. At some point in mid-bit stance, all the joints are at 0 degrees. How much time? Less than 200 milliseconds. So not only the movement has to be achieved in that phase, and we do this 3,000 to 6,000 times a day. We take usually 3,000 to 6,000 steps. Some people do 10,000 steps a day. So 10,000 times a day, you are recycling your joints at within 200 to 300 milliseconds every step you take. And they are going through these excursions all the time. So the quality of movement or quality of range of motion is also critical, and not just the total range of motion. The arc of motion is important, the total range of motion is important. And then think of this is just walking, very simple. Think of something like putting your shoes on, or combined movements where hip, knee, both are involved, or doing a squat where more than 3 joints are involved, including some back issues are involved. So think of it like that, and then make your judgment what is required. I learned this long time ago from Dr. Jacqueline Perry, who probably is one of the pioneers of everything that we know in physical therapy in terms of function, gait. She was originally a physical therapist, went to World War II. Many of you don't know what World War II was, probably you are all young. And then through the funding became a rehab specialist, a rehab doctor. She probably wrote the best book on gait analysis. But she used to always say that if you want to assess the range of motion and a functional use of range of motion, don't apply too much force. Apply minimal force. And she would always show that when you're testing range of motion, the examiner should only use 3 fingers of his hand and apply pressure. Because if you apply excessive pressure, it's not probably, the flexibility is not there to achieve a range of motion quickly in the time that is required to move the joint. What I mean by that, to be just clear, is that if you have to perform a plantar flexion to dorsiflexion to plantar flexion to neutral in 200 to 300 milliseconds time each phase, then you have to have that much flexibility, and there cannot be viscosity or rigidity in the joint. And what is stiffness? Stiffness is nothing but increased viscosity in the joint. So you have to be able to move these joints very quickly, effectively, with minimal application of force. So that is something that stayed with me throughout my life, and that's how I test it. I never test with maximal passive. I do it, but for a different reason. So my rule, this is my rule, this is how I do it. I do active range of motion to measure what the patients can do. I measure passive range of motion with 3-finger pressure to know what the functional range of motion is. I measure passive range of motion with maximally tolerated pressure to know what the end feel is. And then I classify the end feel as soft, semi-rigid, rigid, and bony block. I always place the joint in a correct kinematic plane, for example, subtalar neutral with midfoot locked. Not necessarily I will apply a goniometer to every measurement I take, but I do assess it to see what the active range of motion is. I try to measure it the best I can. I measure passive range of motion with 3 fingers. I always measure that with some type of instrument, either a goniometer, inclinometer, or sometimes we even use video-based system. We measure passive range of motion, maximum tolerated pressure. This is not a measurement, but mostly feel. I look at the endpoint for a soft, semi-rigid, rigid, and bony block. And I'll explain you what I mean by those. And we always place the joint in correct kinematic plane. So this takes time. This is not without time. But if you have to spend at least the first time you see the patient, some time in understanding what the problems are, in my personal opinion. So end feel is soft. Guarding, tone, spasticity are the next. Semi-rigid is fibrosis. Rigid but can be manipulated is capsular remodeling. And doorstop can be either bony block or can be very established arthrofibrosis that does not budge. So all of these are based on a pathology that is associated with it. That's my point. A guarding can be just patient's response to pain. A tone or spasticity is Dewey. Dr. Dave can talk more about it. We do a test called R1, R2, which is basically a range of motion deficit when one moves the joints faster and when the joint is moved slowly, what range of motion you get. And if the difference is greater than 30 degrees, those patients are usually more amenable to splinting therapy, botulinum toxin injections, etc., in the world of neuromuscular control. Semi-rigid is when I get worried about a total knee patient that is starting to get fibrosis around the joint, or a ACL patient. Rigid, I worry about it, that patient is already past the therapy, or maybe difficult to achieve therapy because they have already established fibrosis. And the doorstop, I worry about it a lot because that means that therapy probably won't help. And that's how I decide my end feel. And this has been very useful to me to classify patients differently and then give the treatments differently based on this end feel classification. I don't think this is reported like this in the literature, but this is what I made up. It's been very helpful to me. So once again, soft, guarding, tone, spasticity, semi-rigid, rigid, and doorstop, all are based on the underlying pathophysiology of the joint for range of motion. Here is a great example. This is an example of a normal ankle joint showing adequate dorsiflexion in standing position. This is the fractured side. This is a proximal tibial fracture. Fractured side, that shows that in standing with weight bearing, with sufficient force of the body weight, patient has dorsiflexion. But when you put the sensors underneath, there is no heel pressure. Patient is walking on his forefoot. Well, why is that? Why is this? Is because patient has not neutralized the residual tension in his posterior compartment. What do I mean by that? Is that though with body weight and time, patient can achieve dorsiflexion, in the walking cycle with limitation of getting the dorsiflexion of 10 to 15 degrees in only 200 milliseconds, patient does not have adequate flexibility. So we call this a functional equinus. How would we detect it? If we just applied 3-finger pressure on the patient's forefoot with subtalar neutral, we would know that patient has a functional equinus. And that has to be measured because that is a different measurement compared to a functional testing in standing or a squat. He may achieve a squat, may not achieve a great squat, but he may achieve a squat, but he still walks on his toes. So my point here of this exercise is that if you don't measure, you don't know. You have to measure this. And this is very applicable to lower extremity for both hip, knee, and ankle because they are weight-bearing joints. And the weight bearing has to happen very quickly, every step we take in walking. And walking is the simplest activity I take. Everything else is actually takes less time. Imagine this. A sprinter spends far less time, or a jogger spends far less time. Same case in the case of hamstring tightness, a hurdler would have more difficulty doing this. So I believe we have to neutralize the residual tension in the soft tissues and assess the patient's range of motion carefully with some instrument to know what actual range of motion is. The next topic then is we have to stabilize the joints correctly. Here is an example of an ankle dorsiflexion range of motion measured but having a subtalar valgus. So a valgus of the foot or some of the, actually there is some degree of ankle because ankle has Inman's axis which is slightly tilted to valgus. You can compensate for your tightness of the heel cord. But if you place the subtalar joint in neutral like this, then you actually have reduction in dorsiflexion. This is the primary cause of what we call rocker bottom foot, or foot that collapses in the middle of the foot because there is unrecognized gastrocnemius functional contracture that is not detected by most people. And this has consequences, and I'll show you what the consequences are. But my point here is we must apply, and this can be easily measured as a photograph, as a video, because this is a sagittal plane. You can measure it as video. You can use the apps like Hudl, HUDL if you want it. It's a free app that you can use to measure angles. There are many, and there are new ones coming all the time. Or you can use a inclinometer, or you can use your iPhone, Android, I don't care. But the goniometer still remains the simplest way to do it and the cheapest way to do it. It costs 200 rupees or $5, $10, and then you can use it again and again and again, where you have to pull the phone out. So we have to also see what is the best method, most time preserving method that we can apply quickly in the clinic. So if you have the luxury of somebody else measuring with you, then you can have them measure this for you. It's far more reliable than you measuring this yourself. You can measure both the angle between the lower leg and the heel, lower leg and the heel, and then you can also measure the base of the heel dorsiflexion as compared to the lower leg, and then same thing here, and you can see that this is about 3 to 5 degrees of heel equinus position. Well, what happens when you walk like this? Your subtalar joint has to compensate by going there. And the gastrocnemius never gets properly stretched. So you hide a deficit in range of motion in walking because you never measured it. If you depend just on functional positioning like this, doing a squat, you have never measured it correctly, and then you would have a problem. Well, what's the problem? The problem is this. This is a child with cerebral palsy. And when you have unrecognized tightness or spasticity of the calf muscles, and you start breaking down your midfoot, eventually you have a total breakdown in a growing child of remodeling the foot, and total breakdown, we call this a rocker bottom foot, which is basically collapse of the midfoot, drop of the navicular. Navicular is almost touching the floor, and then you get this type of. We have seen so many cases that are both in spasticity world, but also in the world of plantar fascia. Plantar fasciitis, very commonly seen with therapists. We have seen so many examples of unrecognized gastrocnemius tightness, especially gastrocnemius, but even some soleus and posterior tibialis problems that we have seen that we have been able to effectively do it by addressing that, measuring it correctly, and addressing that. Same thing with the knee, end feel. I always believe in consulting. If I don't understand an X-ray, I consult with my surgeon colleagues or orthopedic colleagues. Why? Because you're not supposed to know everything. And if with practice, you can learn things. So this is an example of what we call a door stop end feel. Because this tibia bone, this slope is supposed to be 80 degrees. Now it's 70 degrees. So there's a 10 degrees of extra slope that doesn't allow the knee to extend fully. So any amount of therapy you do on this will be a failure because all you will do is hinge around this point and open this capsule up and cause more pain. So this is If I get a feeling that this is a door stop and I cannot move this, there are only two possible scenarios. One is osteophyte, two is bony alignment, and three is arthrofibrosis established for more than a year where I just can't budge the joint. So is that the type of patient you should do therapy on? No. But if you don't measure what you are trying to achieve, you don't know. So you keep on applying splint and therapy, and the patient has more pain, and then patient finally badmouths you saying, you know, usne barabar nahi kiya, usne mere ko zyada pain diya, or whatever. So those things do matter in our clinical practice every day, and we need to be aware of that. So that's another example in the knee joint. And this is about hip again. You know, if you are measuring in sitting versus when we are measuring in supine or sitting, there are different measurements of your range of motion, especially rotations. And there's a lot of variability in that, also variability with ligament resection. So I'm not going to spend too much time with you, but I want to discuss some of these important tests. This is hip flexor tightness. Everybody has hip flexor tightness after age 65, 60, 65, everybody gets it. But it affects your outcomes for many things around the knee and ankle, and also around the hip. And the question is it enough to say Thomas test positive? Or is it actually important to measure what the Thomas test is? I would argue that you should measure. Why? And this can be easily measured with an inclinometer. You just place an inclinometer on top right there, versus the 0 is here, and you know how much degrees of inclination the hip femur is in. And then you can do the opposite too. The point is, 10 degrees is normal. 20 degrees is abnormal. 30 degrees is really bad. 30 degrees can cause a lot of lumbar spine problems. We have seen that in many, many patients. It can also affect the knee, how the knee functions with lack of knee extension, and also affects your MTP joint, the first MTP joint with excessive pressure. So if we don't measure, we don't know. So I'm a proponent of measuring certain things. The tool can be debated, but the measurements are necessary, and some of these things are not picked up in the functional testing, especially this. Why? Because there is some degree of compensation that occurs in the lumbar spine that could be missed because of the patients being a little bit bigger here. You can't always get exact measurement of the lumbar spine or pelvic position, but if you stabilize, you get it better. Same thing with the Kendall position for assessing IT band. How much adduction one can do, how much extension one can do relative to this is a very critical component of addressing the TFL and IT band tightness. This is a very classic Eli test measuring the rectus femoris flexibility. For people who practice like Dr. Dave, this is a very important test because this causes stiff knee walking and spasticity. So here we will measure both the passive manipulation range of motion of the knee, but also do a R1, which is a fast stretch to measure the first stop to the stretch. So we will do all that. This is my pet. This is my favorite topic. What we call fixed adduction causes shortening of the leg, and fixed abduction causes lengthening of the leg. And I will go back to that slide to show you this. This is how you lie down, but this is not how you can walk. This is how you walk. So when you tilt your pelvis and do the spinal flexibility, if you have the spinal flexibility, you have apparent shortening. And when you have a fixed abduction contracture, which includes tightness of the TFL, gluteus medius, iliotibial band, fascia lata, or intra-articular problems, then you will have apparent lengthening. This is a commonest problem that one sees after total hip replacement and is always misjudged by many, many therapists. I have seen too many examples of that. There are 10% of the total hip patients are unhappy about their leg length difference because we do not recognize this and carefully measure it. This is how the x-rays are measured, but the point is, ipsilateral lengthening, tight TFL, ipsilateral shortening, tight adductors, scoliosis, hip flexor tightness, or true LRD are all causes of leg length difference. Why is it important? Because 5 degrees of this will cause about a 2.5 centimeters in leg length difference, both for adduction contracture as well as abduction contracture. This is a patient of the hip replacement that shows abduction contracture. This is the commonest problem that is noted by patients as a dissatisfier after total hip replacement. Yeah, you probably have seen this all. The best test for this is the Kendall test to measure and carefully measure, because even 5 degree change makes a log diff difference. Just like, remember this, when the plane is going from Mumbai to Delhi, if the pilot makes an error of 0.001 degrees in its map, he will end up in Amritsar. So same thing, if there's a change that happens at the pelvic and hip level, then at the foot level, the changes are magnified. So a 5 degree change in the angle of the hip joint or pelvic tilt will cause approximately 2.5 centimeter apparent leg length difference in patients who have difficulty with their leg length difference. Why? Because of the same effect of going to Delhi but ending in Amritsar, because of the distance it is away from the hip joint. So that's a very important concept. How do you know that it's true? You have to measure. These are small measurements. You cannot know this with functional testing. There is no way you will know this with functional testing. And if you look and ask people who are unhappy after total hip replacement, they'll all say, my leg feels a little longer. I don't know what it did. He probably put a bigger stem or bigger, longer thing, and then they go for revision of the hip joint. This is a very common problem. But not just common in total hip, it's also common with post-traumatic IM nailing. When you put IM nail, you are always pulling it through here. So when you do that, you do injure some of these muscles and the fascia around and can develop an abduction contracture. So I can go on and on like this forever, but the point of this lecture is to get you more excited about and we have just covered the hip joint and this whole thing about knee joint. Kshitija.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Do I have more time or should I stop here?
So maybe another 2-3 minutes more, you can.
Okay. All right. Okay, fine. So I want to share this example with you. I'm going to go back to my, and I'll stop after this example. Pointer, take it off. Okay. So here is a patient who you can mislabel her as valgus knee. And I'll show you her in slow motion so you get a better idea. If you look at her walking, you see that at this point, a little bit back there, right there. Right there. So this is the drawback of video analysis. A video is a two-planar analysis of a three-planar movement. And videos usually don't pick up. When we try to do video analysis, we should remember this. Videos don't pick up translational or they are good for one plane because video is a 2D representation of 3D structure. It does not compute both. And this is a perfect example of that. Is that if you went by standard methods, you would say that this video shows a valgus knee. Trust me on this, she has no valgus, zero valgus. All she has is a internal rotation of the femur, external rotation of the tibia. So what our exam shows is this. She has too much she has anteverted hips. You have to measure this from the midline, how far her rotation is. How far her rotation is. Same thing here. Same thing here. You have to measure her external rotation. So if she's in external rotation of this degrees and internal rotation of 80 degrees, her midpoint of function is going to be there because we always function at the midpoint. So this is where the total arc of motion matters. So if you have 80 of internal and 20 of external, you're likely to function 100, half of 100 is 50. So you're likely to function at 50 degrees of internal rotation. So that is a problem. This can be happening due to both structural problems as well as muscle imbalances problems. If you are interested, I wrote a chapter in Orthopedic Clinics of North America on how to prescribe a correct physical therapy routine before recommending surgery for patients with patellofemoral pain. We have given the entire gamut of what the soft tissue problems are and what the bony problems are that cause this. And patellofemoral pain is a very, very common finding in our practice. Anterior knee pain is actually more common in younger patients, while as the medial compartment pain is more common in older patients. It is more apparent in female than male patients. And some of these treatment strategies that we do are based on this evaluation of range of motion are very, very critical to success of the patient. So without taking any further time, I will, let me go back to something else, just 1 second. My only thing about manual muscle testing, and we have, Dr. Dave has given a very nice, is that imagine this is a patient and this is a therapist. What we are measuring as 5 by 5 is what the therapist can resist, not what the patient can do. So when the patients advance, we should also consider instrumented testing, which would actually represent correctly patients 5 by 5 and not the therapist 5 by 5. So we at our center, we do it with instrumented testing for lower extremity as much as possible. Now, having said that, I have to come back and admit that we have so far used a hybrid model of range of motion testing and muscle testing, as well as instrumented testing, but also have used functional tests in our advanced patients. So we won't bother doing functional testing early on, nobody should. But at some point, functional testing is important and should be incorporated. We have believed that our PROM measurement, the patient-reported outcomes like WOMAC, are best measured when patient is actually directed to answer the question by the therapist under their supervision. Otherwise, they just get lazy and mark whatever they want. And sometimes they don't even pay attention. The other thing we have noted is that if we are going to do functional testing, it has to be supervised. And we believe that sensor-based, wearable sensor-based muscle testing, functional testing is far better. And we are invested heavily into a company called Dorsavi, D-O-R-S-A-V-V-I, which has sensor-based testing that we use in most of our athletes, running injuries, return to sports like ACL. So I will be happy to share with Kshitija the forms we use for testing the function, range of motion, strength. We don't many times measure everything. We measure the important points in that patient, and that's the clinical experience that you gain in terms of what is it that you want to measure. But we are very careful about measuring certain things like what matters most to the patient, like ankle flexibility, ankle range of motion, knee extension. We have lots of tests for that. This physical exam of the lower extremity is probably a half-day or a one-day course that last year we did in India, in Pune, and hopefully one day we will repeat it again. And I thank you for your attention, and we'll take questions now.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful session and getting back us to the basics. And I would like ma'am to join us now for the discussion. There are a few questions for you that the functional test, is it adequate tool for continuum of care? Do you think so?
Well, as I said in my lecture, continuum of care meaning from acute to subacute to function. Functional testing is very good when you are in the post-acute or subacute to chronic phase. It's important. There's no question. But if you depend just on functional testing and not monitor, in our orthopedic practice at least, if you don't measure strength, how do you calculate the 1RM? You can't. And if you are being very scientific about 1RM, and you have to give 70% of 1RM for strength gain and 85% for hypertrophy, how do you get there? You can't. So there has to be some degree of testing that goes along with function. Otherwise, patients compensate, and the results are very clear. At least in the ACL patients, you have recurrence of ACL tear and not return to its sports because you depend just on function and not on isolated strength testing.
Ma'am, your thoughts on this?
Absolutely, I agree with the fact that if you're talking about continuum of rehabilitation, somewhere down the line you are going to have to measure the strength. Maybe in the later part of your rehab, as sir put it, in acute, subacute, you may need to rely on the functional part. But somewhere down the line, if you are taking each impairment and planning your strategies based on that, at some point you will have to come back to your traditional manual muscle testings. But at the same time, in the initial two phases, that is acute and subacute, you're going to have to rely on functional testing. I'm sorry.
Yeah, very true, ma'am. Another question, ma'am. Can we come to a common consensus for subjectivity of MMT particularly?
Yes, that's a good question, and something as a project it needs to be taken up, because the subjectivity in terms of grading is huge. And as sir said it rightly in the last few of his slides, that strength and power, what is it that you are measuring? Power is different, strength is different. Okay, muscle endurance, your ability to do a particular work, the number of repetitions, the speed with which you execute it, are not entirely graded or reflected in the grades of 1 to 5 that we traditionally do in case of MMT. So yes, we need to come to a consensus. We need to at least start a debate on it more than anything else. So if you start a debate, take a first step, probably we'll reach somewhere.
Absolutely right. Sir, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think just depending on one thing, probably not a good idea. Manual muscle test has its drawbacks. Remember, manual muscle testing was developed in the era of World War II, when there are 250,000 people died and more than 1 million people had gunshot wounds. It was very important to know what the grade trace was, 1 was, 2 was, 3 was. It was also the time when there was pandemic, not COVID, but polio. There was a polio pandemic. And in that times, I still remember going to Nepal, the patients coming from Nepal and Himalayas, when I was with Dr. Mokashi in All India Institute in 1981, where there were polio patients that came by droves that we saw. For them, 1, 2, 3 was very important. Now we are in the era where that's not happening. There's no polio. Hopefully there will be no COVID-19 in 1 year. And so the infectious disease pose a different problem to physical therapists, but everything else we do does not. So the real challenge is, when it's grade 3, we should be adequately measuring it as grade 3 or grade 2 and be alarmed about it. The other thing I feel is very important to measure, my opinion, is we depend on what we call Blix curve. The Blix curve is when we apply force, at the best length. So for example, with the knee joint, your best strength is about 60, 70 degrees of flexion. But we don't measure the ability to hold the knee fully straight. And what is the strength in that? So what I do, I always measure end range. For me especially, I measure end range. Like hip extension, I measure, but I position them in extension to measure their strength, not in flexion. Because I want to measure not only their strength, but their functional performance strength. So I'll write it in my note saying that knee extension manual muscle test at 10 degrees of extension. So I know what it is, because a lot of times there is a problem with the patella, especially with the ankle joint. I don't believe in manual muscle test for ankle at all. You have to follow the Jackie Perry test, which is a strength and endurance test of having patients go up and down their toes 30 times. Try that. Try yourself, Kshitija, and you will see that it's very hard to do.
Yes, sir. I
So,
agree. Yeah.
so not many people actually have 5x5 strength. That's a big problem, because that muscle is used every walking cycle, 92% of the MMT, every cycle it is used. So if you're not strong, so we have to come, I truly believe that there is time to come together and create a consensus or an international consensus on measurements in physical therapy. I think is very needed. You can't just run after video-based apps and say they are all accurate. They are not. We know that. Video works with sagittal plane, usually. It does not work so well with the complex problems. And not a single joint in human body just moves in one plane, as you know very well. So we have to be careful. There are certain things that you can use with it. So wearable sensors, again, you have to be careful. We do use it, and in certain conditions. So we have to come as experts together and figure out what is the best way to measure and have a guideline. I'm very happy to see APTA, American Physical Therapy Association, comes out with guidelines on everything.
Yes.
It's not a mandatory thing, but it gives this, JOSPT will always come out. It's been very helpful to clinicians like me to look at the guideline and then, look at this and see whether it's effective or not for my type of patients. So I think it's important to create a guideline and drive it with basic. You are getting counsel now in India. Everywhere I hear there's counsel in Maharashtra, there may be coming in some other states. So the council should be driving this. Standards of care for evaluation, re-evaluation have to be established in the physical therapy world. That's a much needed thing, because remember this, you're only good as what you measure. You're only good as what you measure and report. 5 years later, they don't care what you said. This seminar will be overtaken by 1 million other seminars. But if there is a guideline, it will be followed for the rest of our lives and our children's lives.
Absolutely right, sir. Another thing, as sir was talking about muscle endurance. So these other parameters of muscle performance, should we comment about that as well and test as well when we are talking about evaluation of movement performance? Ma'am, your thoughts on that?
I agree with that. As I said earlier, also in terms of power and strength and endurance and speed and movement is defined by a lot of these parameters. Okay, so we really need to consider these parameters while we are evaluating the muscles performance. Okay, so I am absolutely for testing the muscles by the therapists themselves rather than going for performance based. So it's always better to have a hands on assessment, but while doing that also need to discuss these other parameters which are also indicators of a skeletal muscles performance and not just the strength part of it. Okay, so I am actually very glad that we started this discussion, and we need to actually take it up as a project, and as sir said, get councils involved and having a guideline so that you reach a consensus somewhere, and it's there in black and white for everybody to see. So endorse it in a way.
Sir, your comments on this?
I agree with what Dr. Dave said. There has to be, this is where the wearables are useful. The simplest example of endurance for walking to me is number of steps patient takes every day. If you just stick your phone in your pocket all day long, you get an idea of how many steps you take. It's as simple as that. So, but we don't ask our patients to do that. So, yes, I agree that the marriage of clinical expertise and developing the profile of the patient clinically first, followed by some degree of technology to measure endurance would be useful.
Sir, there was one question again and again. It has come from audience that what about pain? When there is a pain, should we measure strength or endurance, or what we should do?
Well, the pain, we classify pain. I don't know if you do this, but this is how we do it. We ask patient for defining their resting pain. We ask them for the pain at worst for which activity, and then the best pain. We always have this every day. We ask the patient every time they come for therapy, because it gives an idea about what activity it is that they are worst at. But if they have resting pain and their muscle performance is weaker because of that, it is what it is. It can be pain mediated, it can be swelling mediated, it can be anything. But if you can't lift your leg up because you have swelling or pain, that's what I report. We have to report what you see. So if there is pain, so what? In the end, it's a cascading cycle. If you have pain, you don't move, you get weaker. So I measure it.
Ma'am?
Pain, if it is due to an acute injury, acute spasm, lot of guarding, fear, the patient is not going to be able to put in the maximum efforts that he can. It may not be a single most criteria for starting your rehab program. Okay, you need to first eliminate the factor which is giving so much of discomfort or pain or spasm to the patient, and then probably get a little later into the strength aspect of it. That is exactly what I do. That's how I go about it. You need to obviously monitor the patient's pain every day that it comes to you. Every day you are going to have a different level of pain because it's a continuous process of healing. So as the pain pattern changes, you're going to have to change your priorities then. So at the worst, if the pain is present, don't start with the strength training or strength testing as a priority. And as the pain changes over a period of time with your treatment, consider moving the strength training and strength testing up in the priority list.
Okay, so as I think sir want to say something. Yes, sir.
I just want to add that usually in our patient population, we test range of motion almost every week, or even earlier than that. Many times for the joint that we are treating, we measure before and after therapy. But strength we measure probably once every 2 weeks. And I would definitely not do isokinetic testing on a patient who has a lot of pain. But we measure it on initial evaluation and maybe every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks. We don't measure strength more regularly. I don't see any value in measuring strength all the time, unless there is a big change or patient complains that he's feeling more weaker or something. If there is a report, then I do it.
So as you both said, I think it is a continuous process. We should be evaluating, re-evaluating the patient on these parameters. The last,
I think it is the most critical component of this seminar is that we have to be evaluating and re-evaluating. Otherwise, you don't know what you did.
Absolutely right.
Especially for people who are invested in, I don't do much of it, but people who do dry needling. There is an instantaneous effect. You have to be able to measure that to make sure that you did it right, right? And they recommend that in every course anybody takes, they recommend that, or do soft tissue mobilization, myofascial techniques, or Dr. Dave does a spasticity management technique. We must be able to reevaluate on a periodical basis. And in my opinion, measurements are critical for success of the patient, because you know if you're failing or succeeding. You don't want to do the same thing and expect a better result, right? If you're not getting better. So that's the point.
Okay, sir, last question for you both. If the muscle is having more than one function, then how you go about?
Great question. You can either stabilize one and test the distal one, or you put them in activities that use both. Like for example, I give you an example of rectus femoris. Rectus femoris has to stretch at hip and knee same time when we are walking in swing phase. So I want to test the flexibility in both ways. But rectus femoris is also important mover in terms of the quadricep activity together with the other groups. So then you stabilize one part of the joint. So then it's a two joint muscle. And that's how I do it.
Ma'am?
Yes, absolutely. I agree with what sir said. If it has a multiple function, see, multiple function is either, as sir put it in terms of stability and mobility, a two joint muscle, where you will have to consider the function that it does. And this is one of the scenarios where I would prefer a functional testing of that particular muscle, and also with respect to the kind of work it does. You may have an eccentric contraction, you may have a concentric contraction, and you may test the muscle according to the need of that activity. So if you have a muscle that is doing an important multifunctional task, then you need to test the muscle according to the contraction that it performs at that particular joint. Also, that kind of muscle that does multi movements are going to have multiple fibers. So I think IMT test position addresses quite a lot of alignment issues where you have medial fibers, lateral fibers. So you have the vasti separately, you have the rectus separately, and the starting position and the end position. So IMT, in fact, has taken care of that problem with muscles having multiple origins and multiple directions of fibers. So IMT test positions are actually nice when you are talking about a muscle which has multiple origins and multiple functions or angles of motions, actually.
Very true. So, so I think there are lots of questions, but I think the time doesn't permit us to go on and on. We can go on this particular topic. Thank you both to join us for this wonderful session. And I want to tell you all the audience that moving forward from July onwards, the SIP will be organizing the SIP web once in a month, and the next SIP web is scheduled on 12th July. So see you that time. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, audience.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.